Minister, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg. Now,
My
a lot
pleasure.
of the times when you're in the eye of a storm, it's actually quite difficult to realize what's going on around you and the severity of the situation. If we don't get an agreement, something important, we talk about a bazooka in the next summit on December 9th, is it the end of the euro as we know it?
Some people say these are the 10 days that will define the euro. I think that this is an extremely important summit, but so was the previous one. We are now at a point where, given the interest rates at which core member countries borrow, it is important to have a very clear view of where the Union is going. Not necessarily to have all the decisions taken, but to certainly make it clear to markets and to European citizens that the politicians, that the leaders have a very clear view of how to save the euro. So yes, I think we're all expecting, the bar is high, there's no question about it. We're all expecting significant decisions to happen in the next 10 days.
So how do you actually measure the success of the summit? Is it this bazooka that actually the markets are waiting for?
I don't know if the markets are waiting for a figure. I don't think if they're waiting for a certain number to be put on the table in terms of money available, for example. I think what they're looking for is for the politicians to say that they know exactly where we're going in terms of how we collectively handle the debt, how we're going to move to closer economic governance, and how our institutions will adapt to make sure that the euro continues to remain our currency. Because after all, let's not forget, the euro is not just an economic project, it is a political project, and therefore it requires a political answer at this stage.
But do we not need to just give in to German demands and actually saying, yes, we want more fiscal integration, so that then they allow or actually start, saying that the ECB should take on extra measures? Because at the end of the day, that seems to be the only solution and the only way out of the crisis.
Well, let's be careful. I mean, the ECB has to work within certain statutes. It has already moved a lot in a good direction, I think, by exploiting the various means that it has in its arsenal. One can open a discussion about whether we need to change those statutes, and but it is important to remember that the ECB has played a very stabilizing role. We have been recipients, if you will, of that tendency of the ECB to move into secondary markets, to buy government debt and stabilize the market. But the ECB has simply been buying time for the rest of the system to adapt, to make the decisions which are more institutional. They're not simply putting money on the table, but they're creating the kind of missing links in the institutional architecture.
But is it not frustrating at a time where we actually have technocratic governments which are going through austerity measures and putting them in place, to see that the markets are going at one speed and actually democracies need a lot longer to get their act together?
And between the two, democracies will have to win the day because they are, after all, the popular manifestation of the people and what we will stand for. That does not mean that you can ignore the market. It does mean, however, that you have to take into account when you make decisions. Technocratic governments, I don't like the term. I think no technocrat can be successful without having a clear sense of politics, and no politician can be successful without having a good sense of what works and what does not, and how markets function. And I think we're now managing to overcome difficulties and create this kind of osmosis, which is important.
Now, we're also now talking about the ECB possibly giving money to the IMF or funneling money through the IMF to countries that are in need, and we're talking about around 200 billion in terms of the maximum. Would that be enough? Are you looking again for a bigger round? So I'm just trying to get a sense, if we don't act fast, what is the real risk of a Eurozone breakup?
The fear of a Eurozone breakup has been there for some time now. I am absolutely convinced that we will do whatever it takes to not allow the Eurozone to break up. And I think that those that are sitting on the outside and that are making easy analysis, mechanical analysis, that say it is better for the Eurozone or for a particular country to exit, to take a temporary leave, to go for a holiday and come back, I think they're fundamentally misunderstanding why the Eurozone was created and the willingness of all the members to maintain it. And also they're completely misunderstanding the dangers and the fallout of such a breakup. I think we would be in a completely uncontrollable situation. Therefore, even in extremis, I think that the Eurozone members will do what it takes to be able to hold us together.
But 3 years down the line, we're almost in a worse situation, or in no better situation than we were in 2009. I've been at EU summits with you, we've been in Davos, and every time we said it won't go further than this. Europe is going to come up with the solution, a solution that will firewall the bigger countries, and they haven't done so.
I wouldn't necessarily say that we're in a worse situation. I think in the following sense. In a number of countries, mine included, where unsustainable policies were being followed, these have been reversed, and we're on our way to fiscal consolidation and structural reforms. This does not only concern Greece, it concerns many other countries. Some are in programs, like Ireland and Portugal. Some are not, such as Italy and Spain. So there has been a shift in policies, which is the first very important lesson of the last few years. Secondly, you have an awareness that what is necessary is that first of all, that the problem is systemic and it does not concern just one country, and therefore that bigger actions are important and have to be done. And thirdly, you cannot change the course of the Eurozone within a few months. You have to convince populations that what we had built was a fantastic construction but had missing elements, and therefore all this time was necessary to get there. I wish it was faster. I wish it were the decisions were taken faster than they were taken. But you know, the Eurozone is a collection of members with different electoral calendars, different constitutional requirements, different policy dialogues, populist discussions also being in the way. So I think we've made a lot of headway. Now is the time to act decisively.
But markets aren't giving you time, because yields, for example, in Italy are at 6.5%, and they were 7% for 2 weeks almost.
Indeed, and this cannot go much longer. I fully agree with you. And we have seen, at the same time as I think we are moving in the right direction, we're not moving fast enough, and the markets are moving faster than we are. And if one criticism that I think I have for us all collectively is that we've been behind the curve, that we've always taken half measures, one step behind the market. We have not had the ability, the political decisiveness, if you will, to put a big decision on the table and make it absolutely clear that we have all the necessary means. And that's two very specific things. More money on the table and more ability for institutional features such as the FSF or the ECB to play a role which they're not willing to play. And the counterpart to all this is a closer economic governance to reassure those that put up the money that there will be no moral hazard problems.
What kind of advice would you give to someone like Mario Monti? You were in the eye of the storm when it all kicked off, and at the time, remember, you were saying, no, Greece doesn't really need a bailout, not yet, and then you had to actually ask for one just a couple of weeks afterwards.
I think Mario Monti does not need advice from me. He is an extremely experienced politician and technocrat in the same time. That has a very clear understanding of the dynamics of the Eurozone, not only because he's been a commissioner, but because he's a very good economist and knows perfectly well what the kind of changes that Italy requires. I think Mario Monti has bought Italy precious time to be able to come up with the kind of decisions that are necessary. It is very clear to all of us that a situation where one core member country borrows at over 7% cannot last for long.
In terms of what one of your biggest regrets is there almost a realization now that actually all these austerity measures being implemented doesn't lead to growth? We were thinking 2 years ago that we would maybe have sluggish growth, but we would have growth, and now we're looking at a recession. It seems the worst possible combination, austerity measures coupled with a recession which could actually run quite deeply within Europe.
We knew from the very beginning that whenever you do a very abrupt fiscal consolidation, this exacerbates a recession. But let's remember, Greece had entered recession before the MOU and before the first loan package. At the end of 2008, we were in recession and the deficit was 10%. 2009, we were in recession of minus 3.2, the deficit was 16%. So it's not as if you could have spent your way out of a recession. This is an unavoidable stage that you have to go through. Unfortunately, at the time, a few months after we started the consolidation process, the international environment changed for the worse. You had Ireland coming into the mechanism, you had Portugal coming in, you had decisions which on the face of it made sense, such as the Deauville decision, but created perverse incentives for the markets. And all this made it much harder, so the recession is lasting longer. It is very important to give an exit, to make it clear that at the end of the day, people whose livelihoods are being affected badly, because we've cut wages, we've increased taxes, they will see a better result in the end. And this is why we need to come to a closure with the whole drama, the bigger drama, and markets will calm down, and our own populations, our citizens that have been coming along with this, despite the pain, can see a better future.
Do you think leaders, and possibly even yourself, were actually in denial about the gravity of the situation back then, or were you just overtaken by events almost at every step?
I think not only in Greece, but in a number of countries, the political leadership underestimated how something which was on the cusp of viability could very easily topple over. If you look at our country, our debt to GDP ratio was hovering around 100% for many, many years. And we were managing to keep it there because we had growth. Growth collapsed, and at the same time, during the previous government's tenure, expenditure exploded and tax revenues went down. So a very delicate balance immediately became an unsustainable balance with the debt going up. And we should have seen this coming. So should have our European partners. We then, as a opposition, were arguing that, that there were problems there, but we had to deal with them when we got into government.
And you also actually had another look at the figures, because the figures that we were initially told were just the wrong ones. Do you remember the exact time of when you realized that all these figures needed to be much more inflated to actually reflect the reality?
They did not need to be much more inflated. They needed to actually accurately record what the situation was. Before we came into government, we knew that the deficit would arrive and perhaps get to double figures. We did not know that it would end up being 15.7% in 2009. That was beyond anyone's imagination. So how did it happen? Talk me through. I know that there were a couple of meetings where you're in charge, it's your second week in the job, and you show up and you say, right guys, I've heard a couple of numbers are not that accurate. Well, the elections were in the beginning of October. We got the vote of confidence mid-October, and according to the Constitution, the budget needs to be submitted to Parliament in the first weeks of November. Therefore, immediately, with my collaborators, we started having big discussions in this huge conference room with all the people from the General Accounting Office looking at the figures. And at the end of every evening, as the figures kept creeping up, because things were being recorded and were being candidly put on the table when they were not in the past, and accurate assessments of where the revenues would be at the end of the year, as opposed to assessments which were wildly optimistic, and expenditures which should have been recorded but were not in the past. Everything was being put slowly on the table. And I would ask, is this all? And I would say, I would get, yes, Minister, this is all. And then the next day would start, and then somebody would say, yes, there's also this. And things would pile up. And hospital debts that were never recorded in the past and had to be recorded to previous years. But mostly the understanding that a well-functioning government and well-functioning country must have a good sense of what its data really is. And that is what we ended up. And unfortunately, this brought a deficit at the end of the day of more than double than what was originally thought.
Because
and
before
even
it wasn't really
11, 12
recorded.
points more than what the budget had predicted.
So because before it wasn't really recorded, you didn't really have a central office to actually keep these in check.
We did, but it was a combination of lack of recording, of misrecording, and of inaccurate estimates of where revenues and expenditures would be at the end of the year.
Right, so you have this new figure in front of you. What's your first reaction? I mean, what do you tell yourself? Like, oh, we're in trouble? Or what?
Yes, I think that is... the words were perhaps not those, but they were close to that. I had to let my fellow ministers know, after, of course, the government was informed, and we informed the Greek people what the situation was. I went to Luxembourg, told them that the deficit was double what they thought.
Do you remember their reaction? Disbelief? Anger?
Disbelief, but at the same time, a sense also that perhaps the European institutions themselves should have picked this up much earlier, because there were internal papers that were looking at the figures and were saying that this will go to double digit. So I think that it was disbelief and frustration and fear of what this would mean, but also frustration for the lack of watching over from European institutions. Remember, after that, for example, the rules were changed so that Eurostat could have a much better handle on and audit powers in individual countries, which is something that large countries had vetoed in the past.
But at that time, you didn't think we're going to need a bailout and this is going to spiral out of control. You
we
still
knew
thought
we were
we're on
in a
track
race.
for something.
We knew we were in a race against the markets to convince that we were actually had a plan to reduce the deficit, because we tabled a budget which immediately reduced the deficit by 3 points. Immediately did that, and then followed that with more measures as the market started getting more worried. But I think this was a point at which, taking Greece as a starting point, the markets realized that there was a broader debt problem in the Eurozone and that they had been underpricing the risk of a number of Eurozone countries. Let me remind you that credit rating agencies were giving spreads of 35 or 50 of Greek debt over German debt. Clearly, given the figures, this was an underestimation of the risk. Just like afterwards, they completely went overboard in terms of overestimating the risk, because current spreads are also in no way a reflection of the real dangers.
Did you ever really hate your job? I mean, you discover this, and every day, when was the point that, first of all, you actually realized that you needed a bailout? Was it with the Prime Minister at the time? Was it an external event? Was it when, us journalists were hounding you?
Well, remember, from October until May, when the money came from the loan program, we were in a period in which there was no European mechanism to help countries in need. And this had to be created from scratch. And we kept telling our European partners, we will do what it takes. We are taking the measures. What if the markets close up on us? And the response was, just keep doing your job and they won't do it. And it was clear that this did not happen. It was clear that the markets made up their mind very quickly that just as they had underpriced, they would now close down on Greece and on other countries that were facing this kind of problems. And this period was absolutely necessary for all of us collectively to create the mechanisms, to create the Greek facility, and then the European facility, the FSF, and then the ESM. It was a critical period, and people do not realize that this period between November and March, roughly, was what saved us all, because we managed to create a mechanism to help countries. If the markets had completely seized earlier because they got spooked, we wouldn't have anywhere to hang our hat on, and Greece would have defaulted.
How much did you speak to actually your counterparts? Were you on the phone with them every day? Was there any particular finance minister that seemed to be more involved, or that was able to find consensus amongst all of you at the time?
We were in constant discussions with the ministers of the larger Eurozone countries, my German counterpart, Wolfgang Schäuble, my French counterpart, Christine Lagarde, also with smaller countries with similar problems, Portugal, Ireland, and of course with the Commission and the ECB. And with the IMF, from the time that the IMF started coming into the picture, which was around February, when the larger countries decided that any package would have to include the IMF. We were before that saying to the rest of our European partners that, look, we need a European approach, and we need a European response. Because without a European response, the only institution that actually can lend money is the IMF. We don't want that. We want a European response. And in the end, the IMF was brought into a broader European picture.
After that, what was the moment where you actually thought, well, actually Greece is not going to default, we're going to get the money, but the European project is still in a lot of danger?
One can separate two periods. One is until the Greek loan facility comes into play, and coming up to that period, perhaps some ambivalence in a number of European countries on whether they should be used or not, because we're all hoping that we create something, but we won't have to use it. And from the other side of the Atlantic, a US administration that, having lived through Lehman, was very much attuned to the dangers of what was happening in Europe and was very concerned and pushing towards a European response. After the after the Greek loan facility and the European facility a couple of weeks after that, there was a lull. There was a period in which we thought that it is working and spreads are coming down. And then the decisions taken for the post-2013 period, meaning private sector participation, possibility of restructuring, and subordination of the private debt to public debt, created perverse incentives, because then the markets turned around and said, well, if there is a restructuring 2 years from now, a possible restructuring, and I get my money last in the queue, then why should I be buying debt now? And that's when the spread started going up again, not just for Greece, but also for other countries. Ireland went over, Portugal went over, and we were in a completely different game.
So was that a mistake? Is what happened?
I think that there were better ways of private sector participation than the decision that was taken then. I think that
smaller participation.
If we wanted to have the banks pay, because that's what it comes down to the end, this could have been done through some idea like a financial transaction tax, which ex ante creates a pot that you can use to help countries, rather than ex post with threatening them with a haircut.
And so do you think you were almost a victim in this? I mean, this was badly thought out by European leaders because they wanted to put bondholders to pay a certain part, and actually...
I think the idea that the private sector has to be part of this is a perfectly good one. The question which is the best way to do it. And the way that it was decided to proceed had perverse results. Unfortunately, it did. And so a different way would, I think, have helped us more.
Talk to me a little bit about the next tranche. Now, the EU gave the yes just a couple of days ago to the 5.8. You're still waiting for 2.2 from the IMF. When is that? Have you heard from them? Has the cabinet heard from them?
The IMF's board will meet next week, and presumably will approve that tranche.
And so you're confident that they will approve?
Yes,
if the EU
these are decisions that are taken jointly. The EU would not have approved without the IMF's approval, and given that the EU has approved, the IMF will approve. This was a question, what was holding it was the need by our European partners to have the clarity on behalf of all political parties supporting the new government that they're all behind the effort, that they will implement the policies and they stand behind the decisions of 26th October in terms of what needs to be done, the new loan facility, the new conditionality comes with it, the PSI, all this package. And they wanted to make sure that all the political parties are behind this. And this is because what we have paid in the last 2 years, and we've paid it also in terms of erosion of social acceptance of what we're doing, is the lack of consensus behind these policies. The lack, the government in power was alone in doing something very difficult with sacrifices by the Greek people, huge sacrifices, and everybody else pretending that there is somehow a magic way that you can reduce your deficit without imposing pain.
But the coalition is not an easy thing to actually deal with. You have very different parties, fraught with actually quite a lot of
it's not.
differences.
And it's a coalition that has a limited time in which to work. It's got a mandate, which is to implement the October decisions and the policies associated with those. It is not one that will take us many, many months into next year, clearly, but it is a very important move for the country because we have broken a deadlock and we have opened up horizons which I think are very good for the country and for the population.
Are you getting more sleep now than you were when you were finance minister?
My current job is very interesting and very challenging. It is true that the kind of stress and hours, especially in the beginning of the crisis, as finance ministers, were extraordinary.
Talk to me a little bit about your public power plans, because this is something that you also hope, there's a Helios project, and this is something that you hope will not only boost growth in Greece, but also be able to reduce the deficit longer term.
Well, I think it's very clear that an exercise whereby you just cut expenditures and increase taxes doesn't get you very far if you don't get growth going again. I think we all understand that. It's a precondition for the restoration of confidence, investment, and therefore growth. But you have to help it along, and you have to help it along with big projects. And Helios, energy in general rather, is an area in which there's a lot of potential. Renewable energy, because of the abundance of the sun, the wind in our country. And Helios comes in to fill that gap. Its power is in its simplicity. Helios is Greek for the sun, and the idea is very simple. A country with abundant solar resources exports solar-based energy to the north of Europe, where it is much more expensive, and thereby helps itself with the exports and the incoming investment, and helps the rest of Europe, because it allows the Central European countries, Northern European countries, to fulfill their requirements for renewable energy. So it's a win-win situation.
How do you sell it to investors, though? I mean, presumably you have to, I don't know if you have to put barriers around that, but how do you entice investors to come and invest in Helios?
Well, think of it this way. Insolation in Greece is 50% higher than it is in Germany. A €1 investment in Greece has a much higher yield than the same euro in a Northern European country, because there's no sun. We are simplifying the requirement for licensing, and we're preparing basically a framework whereby a foreign investor, or Greek investors for that matter, can come in and participate in a project that will then have a clear market. Because, of course, this project depends on some country buying and giving us a long-term contract to buy Greek solar-based energy.
But so concretely, it's what you just want to make a big pipeline, basically, from south to north.
We want to plug into Europe's decision to create a common European energy market, to extend infrastructure, to build a better European grid. At the moment, with existing infrastructure, you can already transfer some of that power, but you need more investment to be able to transfer the power based on an installation of roughly 10,000 megawatts, which is 20 billion worth of investment, and that's what we're talking about. And at the end of the day, this big investment will also be helpful in reducing our debt.
Do you have a figure for that? Because you basically said that plus privatization will be able to reduce your deficit and your debt in the next couple of years. But is there a kind of target that you're looking just through Helios?
Well, there is a number in the European Council conclusions of 15 billion euros to come from proceeds from Helios. But think of it, this is a project with an investment of 20 billion and over a 20-25 year time of revenues in excess of 80 billion. So even if you invest more in infrastructure as well, it has huge returns, very high returns, as long, I repeat, as Northern European grid operators are willing to buy not only locally produced solar energy, but also imported solar energy, which is completely in accordance with the decisions taken by the EU to create a unified energy market.
And are you not concerned that actually the European debt crisis is just making renewable energy that much more, I wouldn't say out of fashion, but not the primary focus 3-4 years ago?
We continue to have the kind of targets that we all have for renewable energy, 20% of the total roughly for 2020 in most countries. This means that all countries have to add gigawatts from renewable energy in the next few years to their energy mix. And if you think also of the fact that some countries such as Germany are decommissioning nuclear plants, this leaves a gap that needs to be filled. And it will either be filled by conventional energy, or I think we all would rather it be filled by renewable energy. And in that renewable energy part, imports of renewables and from solar from Greece can be one element.
Minister, just one last question. I was wondering whether, we had you and Mr. Papandreou effectively running the show when the crisis was at its stake. How much more difficult is it for someone who's foreign educated or someone who's seen by citizens as possibly more of a foreigner to actually run a crisis situation like the one we're seeing, where it's about austerity budgets, where people lose their jobs or at least get wage cuts?
I think that it is important to be able to have a dual function. It is to be able to speak to your citizens and make it absolutely clear why the kind of significant sacrifices they're going through are necessary, how there is no other way, how there is a prospect out there, and how you will try to do it in as fair a way possible. But you also need to be able to communicate and have the acceptance of your European partners. Increasingly, all politicians have to work in the European arena, in the global arena, and therefore you have to be able to manage that dual role. I think this is what we tried to do in the previous government. This is what the current Prime Minister, Mr. Papademos, is perfectly placed to do as well.
Minister, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.